Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Let's see where we are. We've been talking about the competition of technologies, where intellectual goods can be locked into hosts, we've said. Sellers prevail in the competition, and the intellectual good and its host can be traded together in commerce as a private good. But if free riders can cheaply unlock the intellectual good, extract it from the seller's host, and embed it in their own host, then they can become secondary publishers of the intellectual good. And because they don't have to produce or buy the intellectual good themselves, they can sell their version of the intellectual good in their own host at a lower price than the original seller, which is a very serious threat to the seller's ability to sell his good. And we've seen that if sellers can succeed in locking an intellectual good into its host so that free riders can't extract the intellectual good from its host, that is, they can't reverse engineer the product or copy the intellectual good from the original host and transfer it into a new host. So if free riders can't extract the intellectual good from its host and use it more cheaply than they would have to pay to buy the seller's host itself, and the host itself can be protected from theft, then in fact, the intellectual good needs no special legal protection because free riders can't steal the intellectual good. It doesn't matter whether it's illegal to do so or not. In this case, we've said, as in the Coca-Cola recipe, sellers have a natural copyright that protects their intellectual good from theft. But if free riders can cheaply unlock the intellectual good from the seller's host, then others can enjoy the value of the intellectual good without buying the seller's host, and they can become secondary publishers themselves unless the sellers can somehow counter these advantages in breaching technology and restore their own advantage in the competition of technologies. Sellers can only sell intellectual goods as private goods when they can successfully embed them in hosts that free riders can't extract the intellectual good from. When the free rider can extract the intellectual good, then the free rider can put the good in his own host and sell that combination to others without having paid for the production of the intellectual good itself. Sometimes sellers can prevail in the competition of technologies without invoking the law to help them deter free riding. So, for example, in bookstores, buyers must be able to inspect books before they buy. They have to have some sense of what's inside the book before they can decide whether they want it enough to pay the purchase price. But of course, if you allow people to read books in a bookstore to decide whether they're going to buy the book, there's a danger that they'll simply read the entire book on the spot and take the intellectual good from it without having paid the bookseller. So, in order to counter this possibility, bookstores typically have very few places to sit, and you are almost never going to see a Xerox machine placed in a bookstore. If you try to stand in a bookstore for too long so that it looks like you're reading an entire book, you're likely to have an employee of the bookstore come and gently ask you either to purchase the book or to move on to another one. All of these represent effective, successful exclusionary technology because buyers can't comfortably extract the intellectual good simply by standing or sitting in the bookstore and reading the book. The bookstore owner can sell the books without any assistance from the law or anyone else. A second example exists in theaters or concert halls or museums, where a performance typically or an exhibit is being mounted, and where it would be possible for people to record the play with a video recorder, or take a picture of a painting with a camera, or to record a concert with an audio recorder. But if you look at the ticket that you buy to enter a museum or to see a performance in a theater or a concert hall, you'll see that there's a contract contained on the ticket. that says, by purchasing the ticket, you agree not to bring any of these effective breaching technologies into the venue where the performance is being conducted. In this case, consensual contractual provisions protect the intellectual good, where free riders do in fact have access to what would, without that consensual contractual protection, be an effective breaching mechanism that would enable them to take the value of the play from the theater and produce it elsewhere, as it were. A third example is in the case of magicians. For a magician, the intellectual good is manifest in the illusion itself. That is to say, the intellectual good is how the trick that the magician is doing on stage is actually done. And so magicians have a very strong interest in protecting the intellectual goods represented by the illusion themselves. That is, they have a very strong interest in keeping how they do their tricks secret. So they try to make it hard to reverse engineer their tricks by not revealing the secrets of the tricks to others, including copyright authorities, because in order to get legal protection for the intellectual goods that are in the illusions that they perform, the magicians would have to reveal the secret of the trick to the copyright authorities, and they're not likely to do that either. Instead, magicians for centuries have all subscribed to a very strict internal, informal moral code, which binds them not to reveal the secrets of their tricks to anyone who is not a bona fide member of the magician's community. That is, magicians police themselves internally with norms where they have no recourse to the law to help them from preventing free riders from figuring out what their tricks are. Since they can't use the law, because then they'd have to reveal the secret of the trick to the copyright authorities, then in fact the internal policing must be very, very effective, and indeed it has always been very effective, at least up until recently with the invention of the slow motion video recorder. Now, the code of silence amongst the magicians is not likely to help them if a magician performs his act on television and his performance can be recorded on a video recorder. If it can be recorded on a video recorder, it can be slowed down, and if it can be slowed down, then almost anybody can see how the trick was done. And so the invention of the slow motion video recorder has been an advance in breaching technology that has severely challenged the magicians and their ability to continue to sell their performances and mystify their audiences in a world where demystification may be as near as the video recorder on the shelf. Sometimes, however, sellers cannot rely on any of these methods to enforce the exclusionary technology. Sometimes free riders have the breaching technology that enables them to enter the channel of exchange, extract the value of the intellectual good, and the seller has no countervailing breaching technology that can stop the free riding. In such a case, if markets for intellectual goods are to exist at all, that is, if the incentives to produce and publish intellectual goods are to be preserved, then sellers must rely on some ancillary legal technology which will be effective in stopping free riders from breaching the channel of exchange and extracting the value of their intellectual good. That legal technology has, for hundreds of years, gone under the name of copyright. And copyright is a legal technology designed for the assistance of sellers and owners of intellectual goods that has been decisively shaped by two different revolutions in the history of communications technology. Revolutions that are 500 years apart: the invention of the printing press in 1476 and the invention of xerographic copying in the late 1960s. Before 1476, all books were written out by hand, which, as everyone knows, is an extraordinarily time-consuming and difficult process. As a result, copying an existing book was extremely expensive. So that if, for example, a scrivener in a monastery had written out a copy of the Bible, that one copy could be reproduced only if another scribe were to sit and laboriously by hand write out the entire text of the Bible to produce a second copy of the book. Hand copying is thus extremely expensive, and it's the only way that free riders have to breach the channel between the author of the book and the reader of the book. In such a circumstance, writers or publishers, had there been any at the time, enjoyed natural copyrights to their intellectual goods. The scrivener who wrote that Bible could be pretty confident that nobody would copy the Bible without his permission, and therefore that anybody who wanted to read that copy of the Bible would have to do business with him. As a result, there were very, very few writers, there were very, very few books, and there were very, very few readers. And as a result, most people didn't know how to read. But then the printing press was invented in 1476, and the invention of the printing press gave free riders a key to unlock intellectual goods from the writer's host and thus to threaten the seller's markets. Now, with the printing press, all a pirate or a free rider had to do was to acquire a copy of the Bible, set the Bible in type on his printing press, a major effort, but once that effort was undertaken, the printing press could produce, in principle, an unlimited number of perfect copies of the book, so that a free rider, with the invention of the printing press, could very easily become a secondary publisher or producer of the intellectual good. The free rider would simply have to acquire, even by purchase, the first copy of the intellectual good in the book, in its host, and then extract the intellectual good, and with the aid of the printing press, republish the intellectual good in different pieces of paper in a different binding, that is, in the free rider's host, and then the free rider can sell the book much more cheaply than the original producer of the book, because the free rider does not have to incur the production costs of producing the initial intellectual good itself. But at the same time that the printing press gives free riders this ability to severely, perhaps fatally threaten the markets of intellectual goods for sellers, at the same time that they do this, the printing presses created many, many new readers and many new writers. That is to say, the printing press, the technology represented by the printing press, was a double-edged sword. At one and the same time, it severely threatened the ability of booksellers to sell books profitably, but at the same time that it did this, it vastly expanded the potential audience for these books by producing many, many more readers than there had been before, and thus opportunity for many, many more writers than there had been before. And this double-edged aspect of breaching technologies, that is, their simultaneous ability to threaten the markets of sellers of intellectual goods and open whole new markets to those same sellers of intellectual goods, this double-edged aspect appears repeatedly in the history of intellectual property. All of the technological devices that have marked the development of the law of intellectual property have had the quality that at one and the same time they reduce the ability of sellers to sell profitably, but they in principle expand enormously the potential audience for the works of those sellers of intellectual goods. English law struggled for 250 years after 1476 to respond to the dilemma created by the printing press. The law tried to protect the sellers of intellectual goods and make sure that markets for intellectual goods could exist so that people could have things to read by adopting a number of measures. First, they tried to ban printing presses, unsuccessfully. Then they tried to license printers so that only certain people designated by the government could use a printing press. But once again, this was frustrated by clandestine printing all over the United Kingdom. Another trick was giving the Printers Guild police powers to enforce these royal monopolies, and thus multiplying the enforcement mechanism beyond the king's police to include the sellers of books themselves, the ones who were most harmed by the actions of the free riders using printing presses. But these too failed to stop the free riding. No effective way to counter the breaching technology represented by the printing press was available for the first quarter of a millennium after the invention of the printing press, until in 1709 the Parliament settled on what was called the Statute of 8 Anne that established the first modern version of copyright. In the Statute of 8 Anne, authors, and by extension their publishers, were to be given an exclusive right to copy and thus to publish their intellectual goods for a limited number of years, after which the copyright reverts to the public. Notice how this works. It places the original copyright, the property right to the intellectual good, in the author of the work itself. That is, the person who, in the first instance, has primarily borne the costs of producing the intellectual good. So, I've written a book, and now I have legal protection for the book. But I'm not a publisher, and I have, at least in 1709, no way to get my idea out there into the world so people can learn from it unless the idea is somehow published. And that's the role of book publishers. And the way in which the book publishing trade evolved after 1709 was that authors would acquire the copyright to their own intellectual good, and then they would trade the copyright to that intellectual good to the publisher in exchange for the publisher's services in publishing the book and making it available to other people. So the publisher would buy the intellectual good from the author and then would own the right to copy that book, that intellectual good. So the publisher can now take the intellectual good, to which it now owns the right to copy, and copy it by producing a potentially infinite number of copies of the intellectual good in books produced by the publisher itself. And then the publisher sells the book the intellectual good embedded in the book as an article of private commerce. And this proved sufficient to keep the free riders out for a very, very long period of time. This was a feat of legal engineering, that has endured ever since. But as we'll see, the second revolution in communications technology, the introduction of xerography in the 20th century, once again changed the balance of power in the competition of technologies and gravely threatened the ability of producers and sellers of intellectual goods to market their products profitably. And we'll talk about that next.